Production and distribution of City Club Forums on IdeaStream is made possible by the generous support of PNC and the Raskin Family Fund, with additional funding from Cleveland State University, Robert Conrad, and the Payne Fund.
Good afternoon. My name is Alex Johnson, and I'm so proud to welcome you to the Eastern Campus of Cuyahoga Community College and the Simon and Rose Mandel Theater. First of all, I'd like to thank the campus president, Dr. J. Michael Thompson, and his team for hosting us today, and recognize from the Jack, Joseph, and Morton Mandel Humanities Center, also located here, Professor Mary Hovanek, who is faculty chair of our Scholars Program, our humanities faculty scattered throughout the theater this afternoon, the inaugural class of Mandel Scholars, and the chair and dean of the Humanities Center, Dr. Lauren Onkey, who you'll get to know more about later on and you'll hear from. We have members of the Mandel Foundation's board with us today, including Tri-C President Emeritus, Dr. Jerry Sue Thornton. Here with us also is President of the Mandel Foundation, Dr. Yehuda Reinhartz, noted author, 13 books, and statesman, and former president of Brandeis University. Did I say 13? I meant 33. See, I was pulling his leg. I was really pulling his leg. Another special member of the Mandel Foundation team is Mrs. Joanne White. She is here as well. This program, of course, would not have been made possible without the partnership of the City Club and its leader, Dan Malthrop, who you've already met. Their commitment to community dialogue aligns with the mission of the college and the Jack, Joseph, and Morton Mandel Humanities Center. We also have members of the City Club board with us today as well. I'm also delighted to welcome Mr. William Bro Adams, Chairman of the National Endowment for the Humanities. In this role, and others described in the program, he has been, and this is unquestioned, a tireless champion for humanities education, its value in furthering democratic ideals with the small d, and in developing civically and ethically responsible citizens, and cultivating leadership and community development. Dr. Adams, we thank you so much for choosing Tri-C to share your passionate message today. But Dr. Adams, I am also proud to share with you that the Mandel Humanities Center was established in 2015 through a generous gift of $10 million from the Jack, Joseph, and Morton Mandel Foundation and the Mandel Supporting Foundations. It is and remains among the largest donations ever received by a community college. What a great, great thing to happen to Tri-C and Cleveland. Thank you, Mr. Mandel, for your support. And of course, Dr. Reinhartz. We are delighted to partner with the Mandel Foundation and their esteemed leader, Mr. Morton Mandel, as we invest in the future of our region by supporting excellence in students dedicated to bettering our world. Let's have our scholars, our first scholars class, 24 of them, to please stand and be recognized. Next year, they will be joined by 200 additional scholars. 100 will come from the existing student population, and the other 100 will be entering freshmen. So you guys be very, very nice to those students coming in, all right? I'm gonna be watching you, you know. We are honored indeed to have Mr. Mandel with us today. He is chairman and CEO of Parkwood LLC, and chairman and CEO of the Jack, Joseph, and Morton Mandel Foundation, which he founded with his brothers. His deep-seated passion for improving communities around the world is evident in the philosophy of the Mandel Foundation to invest in people with the values, ability, and passion to change the world. In his book, It's All About Who, Mr. Mandel shows how important it is to find, recruit, and cultivate grade A leaders, players for important responsibilities in organizations and in the community. He believes that their personal values, we talked about this coming down on the elevator, are essential elements of a life worth living, not only in your personal world, but also in your business world. And according to him, and to many of us in the audience, they include honesty, decency, respect, and generosity. In 2013, Cuyahoga Community College had the privilege of bestowing its first honorary degree, the Doctor of Arts in Humane Letters, to Mr. Mandel for his long-standing support of the college. He was recognized also by the Ohio Association of Community Colleges in 2015 with the Terry Thomas Award for his contributions to colleges and communities across the world. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my great honor to bring to the stage our good friend and neighbor, Mr. Morton Mandel.
I normally don't do that. I was asked to do it. Thank you, Alex, Dr. Johnson, for the introduction. I heard every word of it. It was a little short, but seriously, everything he said really is what I feel. We are trying to make the world a better place. I know that's a global sounding goal, target, but it's what we do. And basically, we do it by investing in people. And we want to invest in the kind of people that Dr. Johnson described, those who care. And I think we've been quite successful at that. And so our gift to Cuyahoga Community College is really just a continuation of our desire to invest our resources where we can get a high return on investment. And that high return is the folks who are going to go through the experience here, as well as other places, go through the experiences here, and alongside being an engineer or a physician or a lawyer or whatever, hopefully they'll spend some time thinking about what can they do to make the world a better place. I'm guessing a lot of you volunteer one way or another. Some of you may devote your life to being a social worker. At one time, I think, had I been born into a family with a more comfortable financial situation, I think I would have been a social worker. And so one of our drivers, my brothers and I, was to make the world a better place. I took a tour of the facility, and it's awesome. I was very impressed. I was impressed with a lot of the students. I was impressed with their faces, not just their words. It's a great facility. So far, Dr. Johnson, I'm impressed with your leadership. Dean Onkey, likewise. So this has been a privilege for me. I'll tell you one other thing on a personal note. Standing here in this theater auditorium, it's kind of emotional for me because it's named in memory of my parents, Simon and Rose Mandel. And so this is a very important occasion for me. Thank you all very much.
Take it just for a second. Mr. Mandel, we are so appreciative of your support of this institution, your commitment to the students that we serve on a daily basis, and the community that they will not only from which they come and represent, but at some point in time in their future that they'll lead in. You made that possible through your generosity and your faith in us, and your trust that we would use that investment wisely to carry out not only your mission, but as a sign and a continuation of your legacy. So thank you so very, very much. Now it is my privilege to turn the program over to Dr. Lauren Onkey. Dr. Onkey has been with us for several months now. She has really hit the ground running. She came to us from the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, where she served as Vice President for Community and Education Programs. Prior to that, she served for 14 years as a faculty at Ball State University in Muncie, Indiana. We are so delighted to have her and to have her as a part of the Cuyahoga Community College family. Before we turn it over officially to Dr. Onkey, we have another responsibility together, Mr. Mandel. This time we got to ring the gong formally, okay? So let's both grab the gavel, okay, together. All right, are you ready?
Yes.
All right.
Chairman Adams, did you know you were coming to the center of the humanities universe when you decided to come to Cleveland?
I did not know that, but I know it now. And it's great to be here, particularly on a day when we're celebrating Morton Mandel and this wonderful gift and this wonderful center. So it's a great honor to be here.
We're honored to have you here and to partner with the City Club. And of course, the City Club is all about free speech and the practice of democracy. And you've written and spoken so eloquently about really practicing and kind of how do you sustain democracy? Can you talk a little bit? I thought that might be a nice place to start. How do you sustain democracy with the humanities? What's the relationship there for you?
I would say that sustaining democracy in any context, in any country, in any time is challenging. It's a challenging political system, and it takes a lot of work, and it takes a very vibrant political culture, constant massaging and working at that culture to keep it strong. And I think the humanities are centrally involved in that. I don't think you can have a strong democratic political culture without an acquaintance with American history, in our case. I don't think you can have it without a pretty strong acquaintance with the principles of liberal democracy as we've developed them over time. And I don't think you can have a strong culture of democracy without a pretty vibrant sense of cultural awareness and understanding, both of the cultural diversity in this country. And now, of course, we live in a globalized world, and so democratic citizens have to know something about the cultures of the world as well as the cultures of the United States. All of these things are humanities topics. In fact, in some sense, they're the core of the humanities. And so I think they're centrally involved, and without them, we risk, I think, losing that democratic culture and the active and intelligent participation of citizens.
You're in an elevator in a hotel somewhere, and somebody's being polite to you, but they say, you know, what are the humanities anyway? I mean, we sort of throw that word around at colleges and universities. Of course, we all know what it is, but how do you communicate that outside of colleges and universities?
It's a good question, and I get asked that question all the time. And as some of you know, because you heard a radio piece that I was involved in just a couple of days ago. I guess it was on public radio here the day before yesterday. Some people talk about the humanities in terms of the academic disciplines that classically compose them. I don't think that's the most obvious or meaningful way to talk about them. So I rather prefer to talk about the things about which the humanities are always in one way or another addressing, and those include our history, our culture, our ideas, and our values. In almost every case, when the humanities study and when they express themselves, they're talking about one of those dimensions of our lives. And of course, we live in those places all the time, every day, 24/7, and we all traffic in the strong challenges and work of culture and history, ideas and values. So it seems to me it's better to talk about those things in public settings than it is to talk about the academic formations of the humanities, though those are the forms of knowledge, obviously, that give us access to those dimensions of our lives.
The NEH's job is to really sustain the humanities, and you're just past the 50th anniversary. Could you talk a little bit about the founding of the NEH and its purpose at the founding, and perhaps how it's changed?
As some of you probably know, we were founded by the stroke of Lyndon Johnson's pen on September 29th, 1965, the National Foundation on the Arts and Humanities Act. So we're just a little more than 50 years old, and we've been celebrating the 50th anniversary throughout this significant year for us. The NEA and the NEH were created at that very moment, twins separated at birth, I like to say, but working very much in similar terrain. And the key arguments that were used in the advancing of that legislation included a couple of pretty important things, and I think they're still relevant. Going back to your first question, you can't have a vibrant democracy without a strong public and educational investment in the humanities. They belong in and they are critical to our democratic political tradition. There was another interesting argument that a great country, as the United States had become the greatest country in the world following World War II, suddenly preeminent in military strength, in industrial and commercial strength, the argument went that as we're leading the world in those categories, we also have to be leaders in the cultural dimensions of our lives. We have to have a great and vibrant culture as we have a great military force and power, and as we have a tremendous financial might. I think those two arguments are still relevant, but there was also a third, which I think is just as important, and it was the notion that a culture that is exclusively committed to technical and scientific disciplines, as important and as profoundly significant as those disciplines are, a culture that is simply committed in those forms of knowledge is a narrow culture, and it's one that we will, I think, live ultimately to regret. So those were the three kind of linchpin arguments. The endowment has changed quite a bit over its 50 years. We've given away $5.3 billion over that period of time in about 65,000 grants. And they've gone to institutions all over the country. Initially, NEH was pretty focused on research, as NSF was in its own way. But very quickly, we became a very public organization and started to fund not just educational institutions, but museums and libraries and cultural organizations all over the country. We have a deep commitment to documentary filmmaking. Next Monday, the Jefferson Lecture, which is our biggest annual event, is happening in Washington. The lecturer is Ken Burns. We were the first funder of Ken Burns documentaries going back to 1979, a film called The Brooklyn Bridge. We have funded 15 of his subsequent films, and he's speaking about that tradition and relationship on Monday night in Washington. That's a good example of some of the very public work that we've done in television, in radio, and as I said, in all of these cultural organizations. We also have a deep and significant practice in the preservation of humanities resources of all kinds, paintings, documents, all kinds of collections that are, of course, threatened by time and use over time. And so it's a very broad portfolio now, very public, and very integral to what I call the humanities ecosystem in the United States.
You had mentioned the technology being referenced in the initial Act of '65. It's very prescient when you read that. I mean,
yeah.
it talks about us not being, that we need to be masters of technology and not the other way around. It's beautifully written for an act of Congress.
It is,
thought.
actually.
But why don't we talk about that a little bit, because I know the Mandel scholars have talked very passionately about STEM versus the humanities, and they feel like they're pitted against each other, and they would like to see more of an integration there. But how do you think about in the current climate, how we might create more of a relationship between the humanities and STEM?
I think there are enormous opportunities for that. I'll say to begin with that I do think there has been a narrowing over the last decade or two of the conversation about education in this country. And I think it has been narrowed to a preoccupation, in many cases, with STEM. I have to say, there's nothing wrong with STEM. It's a hugely important and fundamental part of everything we do. But that preoccupation and the narrowing of the way we think about education has not served the country well, and I don't think it's serving our students well. I think one of the ways to rebuild our commitment to the humanities and to the arts as well is to think about the ways in which we can integrate them with the STEM disciplines. And I think the opportunities are enormous. I was struck by the students this morning with whom we met and their interest in this topic. The possibilities for integration revolve around a couple of obvious facts. One, science and technology raise issues for all of us, which science and technology cannot themselves solve because they're not technical issues. Think about the recent amazingly interesting, complicated debate that Apple caused, or Apple didn't cause it, but the iPhone sort of caused it, or the iPhone was the focus of this interesting conversation about liberty and security, and what the trade-off and those hugely important values are in this country, and where we end up as citizens on that question. That's a question that technology raises, but it cannot solve, and so you need the conversation between the humanities and the technical disciplines on that very topic. So that's a great example. But there are many others. We had a talk this morning about biomedical engineering and the enormously interesting, profound questions that are coming up in the biomedical engineering community about these new gene editing technologies and what we're going to do as a society with these technologies. We're on the verge of really now voluntary, willful control of the human genome. It's maybe one of the most important moments in human history. And we need to have a public conversation about what that power enables us to do and what we should do with that power. So that's another example. But there are also places and ways in which the humanities and the sciences overlap. I mean, think about all of the things in daily life that are treatable and need to be treated both by scientific and other kinds of humanistic reasoning. And so there too, I think, you can have very powerful conversations between the humanities and the STEM disciplines. So that integrative movement, I think, is a huge opportunity for the humanities. And I think it's very important that we start that conversation in our educational institutions.
What kind of, from again where you're sitting, you're moving around the country, going to a lot of institutions, what sort of interesting projects do you see, maybe especially around digital technology in the humanities?
The digital humanities, as we call them at NEH, and as they're called in the academic world, is an enormously exciting terrain for humanities research and knowledge, and it's happening all over the country in big universities, small universities, and beyond the university. These enormous databases that are now made available by digital technology are being used in extraordinarily interesting ways by humanities scholars in analyzing things like Shakespeare. You can now put every word of Shakespeare into a database, and you can do very sophisticated, complicated analyses of word use, word appearance, the way Shakespeare constructed different kinds of phrases and his use of language generally. These things were impossible 10 years ago, 15 years ago. So there's a whole range of things that are happening in that sphere. The other very interesting thing that we're involved in now at NEH is prompting humanities scholars to use digital technology for their expression. Not just translating books into digital books, but using digital products and processes as sort of the foundational expression of different kinds of humanities work. We call these born digital projects. So instead of a book, a humanities scholar and a fellow that we might fund would end up publishing a born digital project, a purely digital project that is available on the internet to the public, but which doesn't involve a book.
Yeah.
So there's lots of opportunities and exciting things happening there as well.
We're here, obviously, at a community college where more than half of all American students college students are enrolled in community colleges. And you've made the point that that means that most of the liberal arts learning that's going on around the country, therefore, is happening in community colleges. Can you talk a little bit about what you think the significance of the work in a community college can be?
Yeah, it's really been a learning moment for me at NEH. You know, I came from working at private colleges and universities my entire career. I, of course, was aware of community college, but it wasn't until I got to NEH that I really understood the extent, the range, the power, and the breadth of this sector of higher education. And so for me, it's been a hugely important learning experience. Not only are most American students in higher education enrolled in community colleges, the only part of higher education where humanities concentrations, majors, are increasing is in the community college sector. It's the only place. So something really interesting is happening in community colleges, and I've become sensitive to the ways in which I think these institutions are really deeply committed to the education of the whole person. Publicly, we think of community colleges as pre-professional places, and of course they are. But I've become now aware of how deeply committed they are to these broader ranges of education and to the value of liberal learning as a foundational platform for their students. Many of the students here will go on to four-year institutions. That's part of the reason, I think. But it's also something about what's happening in community colleges that I think is very exciting. So to me, the combination of the scope of the sector and how vibrant liberal learning is as a goal provides enormous opportunities for NEH and for others who care about the humanities. So I'm very excited to be involved in it. I'm very excited to be here. The other thing I would observe that is important in your question is that most new Americans in this country, Americans coming to us and becoming citizens through the immigration process, are going to community colleges.
Yeah.
So the issues of democratic citizenship and the training or the education for citizenship is very, very important in these places. And it's a work to which I think these places are quite clearly committed. And it's enormously important for the future of the country, I think.
You know, we started out talking about practicing and sustaining democracy. So, it strikes me that we have opportunities in community colleges to use the humanities to, if you will, apply the humanities in a way that we really can't in other places. It feels to me as if it's becoming an advantage to do the humanities at a community college around issues of access and democracy.
I think that's right, and you pointed it out this morning, and the students did too. That's partly because at community colleges, students necessarily have a very strong connection to place and to the community institutions where democracy actually occurs. So the students here are most likely from this area, and they're most likely going to stay here. So the opportunities to connect them to real community issues, to real community institutions and organizations, those opportunities are enormous. And I think they're much more meaningful in many ways than is the case at residential colleges where people come from very far away places because they're really not connected to place in a significant way. So I think that's one of the special advantages the community colleges have, the closeness to place, the sense of place, and the closeness to institutions in the place.
We are also really thinking hard about leadership and how by studying the humanities that we can explore values that we hope will give the students opportunities to develop their whole selves. I wonder if I could ask you a little bit about your own leadership. You've been a college president and now, of course, chair of the NEH. Has the humanities had an impact on you as a leader, how you think of yourself as a leader?
I'd have to say yes. I mean, my whole life has been spent sort of in one way or another in the humanities. So I think inevitably it's influenced me. I think it particularly influenced me and was helpful to me in the work I did in political theory and philosophy, where I thought a lot about public issues, processes, events, and how you think about those in sort of expansive ways. I think those disciplines and that work that I did has been especially helpful. But more generally, I think that the humanities are critical to a deep curriculum, I would say, on leadership. Leadership's a complicated topic, and it's not a simple one. And I think we've gotten used to thinking about leadership and teaching it in a narrowly business-oriented sort of context. I think leadership in its fullness needs to be treated much more broadly than that. Business leadership is hugely important, obviously, in this country, but there are all kinds of leadership positions, leadership modes, leadership opportunities, and they're not all exactly the same. So I think the richest kind of curriculum for leadership discussion really does require a deep exposure to the humanities in literature, in philosophy, in political theory, and other fields in the humanities. I was in an event in the Folger Library. Everybody knows it's the 400th anniversary, right? And of Shakespeare, and they had a wonderful event at the Folger Library, and they had a sort of a TED Talk morning, and they chose a number of people to give little 2-minute vignettes on some encounter that we've had with Shakespeare. And I talked about teaching King Lear at Stanford when I taught it. And what I talked about was the drama of King Lear being a drama about an organization man, basically, right? Organization in the political sense of the word. And the inability that Lear exhibits in that play to leave his role as an organization man in contexts where it has become completely inappropriate. And really, his struggle in that play is, from one point of view, the inability to move out of a certain habit of mind and activity that is based upon this narrow construction of a certain social role. You can go on in Shakespeare and find, dozens of examples of this. But I think throughout the humanities, throughout literature, there are profound studies of leadership that are hugely important to understanding actual experiences of leadership.
In your own journey as a scholar, as a thinker, what did you major in college?
I majored in philosophy. And I would tell, as a college president, I would say, philosophers do okay. Don't put it out of your mind because it doesn't have an obvious professional expression apart from being a philosopher. And most philosophy majors are not philosophers in the end. But it was an enormously good choice for me. Philosophy has a tremendous breadth. It exposes you necessarily to all kinds of historical material as well as analytical and other kinds of intellectual material and activities. And it permitted me to think about things in very imaginative ways. So I think it was the best possible training for being a college president. I know there are some other college presidents here, past and present, and I think they know what I mean. The ability to identify, sort of fundamental issues and cut through the specifics to powerful general questions is very helpful in that role. And so is the clarity of thinking and imagination. So to me, as a college president, and basically college presidents are running big organizations, right?
Mm-hmm.
They're a lot like CEOs in some ways. I thought it was hugely useful and incredibly helpful.
And you served in Vietnam. Was that a pre-college or after-college experience?
I had a bad first year in college. When I went to college at the age of 18, I was too young. I'd had some family tragedy that I hadn't gotten over, and I ended up having a really rough year. So I left, and this was 1966, and it struck me that it would be a good idea to join the Army. I'm not sure I can recover the thinking that led me to that conclusion. This was June of 1966, and the war in Vietnam was just building up. But nonetheless, I pressed ahead and volunteered. I was sent to Fort Knox and then got involved in Officers Candidate School, was commissioned at the age of 19 at Fort Sill. And a year later, I was in Vietnam. And it was a bracing experience, I would say. But it left me deeply curious about all kinds of things, including, the really deep moral questions that people in combat and in conflicts face. And it seemed natural for me to segue to philosophy from there, because these really were questions about, every possible dimension of experience in war, and how it causes you to turn inward and ask lots of tough questions, So it was, for me, a very natural step when I came out. And I've been interested ever since in the whole issue of coming home, the legacy of war as a matter both of historical significance for the country, but as for veterans. And at NEH, we're doing a lot of work with veterans. We're also funding big projects that have to do with the legacy of war. We're funding Ken Burns and his fantastically interesting project on the Vietnam War, which will be coming out on PBS in the fall of 2017. 18 hours on Vietnam. Ken's the first filmmaker that spent a lot of time in Vietnam, talking to both what used to be North and South Vietnamese about the war. So it's going to be a dazzling thing. But NEH has maintained a kind of a full interest in both sides of the experience.
And it's about people finding their own stories in that larger story. Why am I here, and what is this all about? I mean, that kind of exploration is what we're trying to do.
Yeah, and one of the fundamental, who am I? What is my story?
Yeah, right.
How does my story relate to the stories of the people around me and the culture of which I'm a part? The novelist Robert Stone, who wrote about Vietnam very powerfully, said a powerful thing once. He said, culture is the answer we give to the question, who are you, and what is your story? It's a nice way of thinking about culture, I think. But war certainly raises those questions, but we struggle with questions of identity. I do, anyway, all day.
Right, beginning first thing in the morning, right? I have one more question before we move it over to the audience, and if folks have questions, you can line up at the mics on the stairs. So we are barreling down the highway to a presidential election, and it's an interesting
I've
one.
heard.
Yeah, and you're from Washington, but as we think about practicing and sustaining democracy, what might we all take a moment over the next few weeks and read or watch to maybe get ourselves ready for the debates ahead?
Well, one of the interesting questions I've had, I bet you've had it too, is what are the precedents, without commenting in any particular way on what we're living through right now, what are the precedents in American history for what we're watching? We're watching something quite unusual on both sides, I would say. So how do we get oriented in that? I think we've all found some of this quite surprising. Is it surprising? I mean, ought we to be surprised by it? Or are there things in recent or deeper American history and life that kind of teach us about this moment? So I think that's one very interesting question. And I know that students and faculty here in the room are probably seeing that come up in their classes. But the question of history, I think, is very lively in this election. The students were talking about Plato this morning. I've been thinking a little bit about Plato lately. You know, and Plato was not a friend to democracy, by the way. He was a critic, a pretty deep critic of democracy. But critics of democracy need to be listened to too. And so, you know, you think about how democracies work, how they come to the conclusions they come to, and how, as a system of governance, they can, you know, undermine their own principles, for example. Plato was certainly very interested in that. So it raises philosophical questions, I think, for which there is precedent, certainly in the history of Western thinking and in our own philosophical and political tradition in the United States. So those are a couple of the humanities questions.
Everybody go read some Plato.
That have been on my mind.
Got some questions?
Dr. Onkey? Dr. Onkey? I have a question. I was a guidance counselor for more than 30 years in a neighboring suburb and helped over hundreds of students to attend Tri-C, most of whom came here because it was nearby, inexpensive, and offered a very practical, applied route to a career and hopefully a better life. Do you see the humanities as enhancing those practical, applied job routes, or do you see careers in the humanities that students can seek?
I see both. I see both careers in the humanities, and I see both ways in which, in any career, the humanities are hugely important and I think maybe decisive for a lot of people. On that point, I would just say that the humanities are the sort of the laboratory in which a lot of really fundamental intellectual capabilities get developed and exercised. Most powerfully, the ability to think, the ability to write and express oneself powerfully in speech and in writing, and the ability to ask questions. Those are deep humanities sort of attributes and skills, and I think they're enormously important in any career. I'll tell you, as a head of an organization, and I know my fellow presidents in the room would agree with this probably, the thing that most often stops people in careers that I'm familiar with is their communication skills. Or it's one of the things that stops people and limits people very powerfully. So the humanities, as I say, are a kind of a laboratory for some of these deep intellectual capacities that I think are hugely important in any kind of career. The other thing that I heard a lot as a college president was, you know, a breadth of knowledge and a breadth of understanding, a breadth of sensitivity to the kinds of things that we all experience and encounter in workplaces and beyond. That kind of broad foundation is hugely useful in the workplace, especially now, especially in a globalized context where cultural variety and diversity is manifest in almost every workplace now. So that kind of cultural capacity and literacy is hugely important. Those are all things that I think we undervalue, we underestimate as being essential to careers. Of course, there are humanities careers, and they happen not just in colleges and universities, but they happen in museums and libraries, in cultural organizations of all kinds. They happen in historical sites, they happen in publishing, they happen in magazine work and journalism, and those fields are changing very quickly, but they're not going away in some fundamental way. So both are true, but we should not underestimate the professional value of the humanities in every single professional field.
Hello, Dr. Adams. My name is Jen Hunt. I'm one of the Mandel Scholars. And my question towards you is, we get asked a lot in our studies about leaders and about our own favorite leaders. In your life and in the NEH, what leader would you say has impacted you the most? And what part of the NEH or humanities itself impacted you to actually go in that direction?
So what is the question, what leader do I admire most?
Yes.
Yes.
Wow, that's a tough one.
They're turning it on you now. What
Yeah,
we've
yeah.
done to them.
Well, you know, because the matter of race relations has been so painfully with us over the last 24 months, you know, I think a lot about Martin Luther King and the extraordinary talent he had. And the talent really was his ability to express at one and the same time a kind of reality about what it meant to be an African American in the United States, but also to hold up an ideal that people could march toward together, and to do that in a way that was not divisive. I heard him speak, I had the honor of hearing him speak at Dartmouth College in 1962. This dates me a little. And it was a dazzling experience, I have to say. And it was that capacity to inspire, to point to something and say, this is where we can go. While recognizing, you know, the huge amount of pain and suffering that the African American community historically had experienced in the United States. So it's come back to me a lot over the last 24 months because, you know, we're in the middle of a kind of a reckoning, I think, around the topic of race relations. Speaking of the utility of history, and the importance of understanding history, no question, I think, is more important for us, and no question demands a kind of look back into our past. But again, he had that incredible ability. I mean, there are many other people that, you know, you could sort of seize upon and admire their leadership abilities, but he was certainly extraordinary in that way.
That's it.
Hello again, Dr. Adams. It's a pleasure to see you from a different view. So as we all know, social media is no longer a fad. It's not going anywhere. So how can we enable social media to be a tool for young learners to prevent them from being numb to the atrocities that go on in the world and use it as a tool for humanities to connect them to one another across states and majors and the old to the young? How can we do that to make a more profound universe?
Well, when you figure out the answer to that question, you let me know. And by the way, you're much more likely to find the answer than I'm likely to find the answer. Because,
where would you like
because
us to
you live
start?
in this world in a different way than I do, though I was tweeting earlier. One of the concerns I have about that technology, and indeed all of the ways in which the digital envelops us, is what it's doing to us and what it's doing to our social relationships. I mean, this is not a new idea. A lot of people worry about this out loud. We don't have a very good answer to the question of what it's doing to us and how we can turn it in a positive direction. Now, there was a lot of talk, as you remember, during the poorly titled Arab Spring about the use of social media in a sort of in democratic movements. You know, whether that was really a good example, I don't know. But So there has been some discussion about the way in which these connectivities empower people in new ways and enable them to act together in new ways in the service of democratic ends. I think there's some truth in that. I think there's some other things about it, though, that may be limiting in those contexts and in others. And I worry particularly about this relational question. I will tell you that at NEH, we have started to develop games, digital games, for computers that pick up humanities themes. We supported a game developed by WNET in New York about immigration that followed the life of a young girl in the 1890s, a Jewish immigrant, in New York in the tenements, down where the Tenement Museum is now. And it's a very interesting game. So we're trying to explore ways in which we can use some of this technology, not social media per se, but gaming technology, which is related, and turn that in the service of humanities work. And I think there are ways. I'm not sure I see that completely with Twitter yet. Ken Burns said an interesting thing when we were together on the Hill a couple of weeks ago. He said, some things take duration, right? And humanities work, in many cases, takes duration. You have to sort of stick with it. You can't read a Shakespeare play in 10 minutes. You have to kind of hang on to it for a period of time. So whether or not the humanities can get out of that long form modality and develop into shorter modalities is, I guess, the question you're asking. And I'm not sure of the answer. But we're going to be exploring, more importantly, the humanities communities will be exploring for us in ways that will inspire our grants, things like this. So I'm hoping that we'll get proposals from people in the digital space about how they can put that technology in the service of the humanities.
Absolutely.
Maybe you'll be the one.
There you go.
I hope you are.
I would be honored to do so.
Hello, Director Adams. My name is Professor Farrell Andrews. I teach art history here at Tri-C. And I have a background in law. I practiced law for quite a while before I got some sense and switched over to art history as a result of a project here. And my students are often bringing me new information about our past, new discoveries about the pyramids, the Sphinx, other things like this. I don't read it in the newspapers. And I'm wondering, how is it the National Endowment of the Humanities can contribute or has contributed to disseminating information that I don't see in my newspaper, the few that we have. And I see for myself that there's got to be a role. Someone must take up that role that will make up for the lack of information about our past and our present and our future. Could you comment on that, please?
Sure. By the way, I would say that most of the work we support doesn't end up in the newspapers. I mean, it ends up in books and other things in other places, but not very often the newspapers, I regret to say. Speaking of duration, newspapers have suffered the lack of duration, I think, in a lot of different ways. And of course, now they're morphing into something completely different. You know, it struck me that the very interesting student movement that's been going on in this country, which I know has been complicated for colleges and for college administrators, but the student movement recently that is sort of resurrecting or showing for the first time things about organizational and institutional history that weren't well known and are certainly complicate our views about institutions and maybe historical figures in institutions. I know that's been a difficult passage, but I don't think the students were wrong to do that. I think part of the work that the last couple of years, as I was saying, has elevated is re-looking at the past from the point of view of the drama of the present. And it's an interesting observation that as we go through time and as we experience the world, our views of the past change. And the past changes for us. So that's an important thing, and I think it's an important part of humanities work to admit of that and to nurture that, as hard as that's been. So that's one thing I would say about it. We're open. I mean, we don't, the interesting thing about NEH is that we don't do anything. We support, we fund people doing things and institutions doing things in the name of the humanities. But we can indicate directions, or we can invite a certain kind of interest. And I think we're trying to do that in a number of different ways, some of which I've mentioned. We did a very interesting project a couple of years ago in association with the celebration of the Civil Rights Movement and the anniversaries there. We did fund some films that we sort of initiated on the Civil Rights Movement. And sort of, I think, in that way, we were trying to reawaken a conversation, a national conversation, about that series of events in time and to refresh the country's memory. As we did that, I don't think we had any idea of what was about to happen in the country. But I think what you're saying is that we should be trying to prompt certain kinds of work. And I think it's a very good reminder that one of the important roles of the NEH is to be prompting people to think about certain kinds of things, including, I'm happy to say, community colleges, which we're starting to do more of. So it's a good reminder of one of the sort of fundamental things that we have to do. We have been prompting people very strongly on the question of the military, the legacy of war, our veterans. We've been prompting people in some ways on these questions having to do with race. We've been prompting people generally on the public relevance of the humanities and the relationship of the humanities to our national life. And we'll keep prompting in those ways.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Tim. Okay.
Yeah, we want to turn this into a television program. So unfortunately, we are out of time, but if you do continue to have questions, we invite you to join Chairman Adams on Twitter. He is at NEH Chair. He'll respond. And I do want to say before I close out the program, too, that immediately following this program, some of the Mandel Scholars will join us on stage to share some of their work and some of their learnings over this first inaugural semester of the Mandel Center for the Humanities. So we invite you to stick around for that. We do understand that if you have to go, you have to go, and that's fine. But you are also then invited to check it out on YouTube, because we will add it to our YouTube channel. And that goes for the television audience as well. So now, more formally, ladies and gentlemen, we've been enjoying a conversation between Chairman William Adams of the National Endowment for the Humanities and Dr. Lauren Onkey, Dean of the Mandel Center for the Humanities at Tri-C. I want to thank Tri-C for their partnership in today's program. I want to thank Mr. Morton Mandel and the Mandel Foundation for all of your investment in our community. You are indeed, sir, changing the world, and I thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, our forum is now adjourned.
Thank you. Thank you.
For information on upcoming speakers or for podcasts of the City Club, go to cityclub.org.
Production and distribution of City Club Forums on IdeaStream is made possible by the generous support of PNC and the Raskin Family Fund, with additional funding from Cleveland State University, Robert Conrad, and the Payne Fund.